much for coming. It is a great privilege to speak to you all. Um, on the PowerPoint, we have the first page of Beowulf from the Beowulf manuscript, and I stand on the shoulders of many giants, or in Old English, enter your work, in discussing the influence of Beowulfian poetics upon Tolkien. That Beowulf was a profound source of scholarly interest and creative inspiration for Tolkien is uncontested. Some of you may indeed have heard Professor Mark Atherton and Dr. Laura Varnum speak in this series, and both have touched on Tolkien's indebtedness to the Beowulf poet. Having first encountered Beowulf as a student, Tolkien proceeded to compile his own commentary and translation of the poem following his appointment to the Anglo-Saxon professorship in Oxford in 1925. His 1936 lecture, The Monsters and the Critics, has achieved legendary status, forming the bedrock of Beowulf literary scholarship arguably up till now. It decisively rejected the damning view of Beowulf as bad history, and reinstated the poem as a work of art, instigating its study as such. Tolkien's criticism of and creative engagement with the Anglo-Saxon epic, however, continued into the 1940s, culminating in what he called his Sellic spell. So the title Sellic spell is taken from a line in Beowulf itself, and we can see it here. Huilem vid arach, sod on Sellic, huilem Sellic spell rechte after richte. Tolkien translates these lines as, now the poet recited a lay true and bitter, or again, some wondrous tale rehearsed in order due. Tolkien's Sellic spell represents an attempt to restore the folktale kernel which he and other scholars believed lay behind Beowulf. One might term this an act of critical and scholarly subcreation in the asterisk reality of Northern Germanic folklore, to borrow Tom Shippey's term for an assumed historical reality that is reconstructed by philology. Tolkien stated his aim to present a story, not the story, of Beowulf, by stripping back, in his own words, the particular heroic or historical elements in an experiment of stylistics. Tom Shippey asserts that Tolkien felt a virtual identity of motive and technique with the Beowulf poet. Investigating this creative engagement with Beowulf is not only to elucidate the scholar's methods, but to illuminate a creative consciousness. So as it stands, the Sellic spell has various versions. So there's a modern English version in its earliest form, according to Christopher Tolkien, in what he calls Manuscript A. He then develops the final text from Manuscript C, which Christopher believed was Tolkien's final version of the Sellic spell. What I'm most interested in, however, is an Old English version, likely translated from the earlier manuscript, which isn't full, so it doesn't cover all of the narrative of Sellic spell, but I think offers us many interesting perspectives onto Tolkien's creativity. But before we examine that in detail, it's helpful to go through briefly the plot lines of each respective version of the tale. So, in the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, he is the son of Ecgtheow, nephew to the king of the Geats. He arrives at Heorot, the court of the Danish king Hrothgar, and kills Grendel, the monster, and then Grendel's mother. Upon his triumphant return to Geatland, he later becomes king, and in the 50th year of his reign, a dragon plagues the land. He and the dragon face each other in mortal combat, both die, and Geatland is left kingless on the brink of war. Interspersed with these monster fights are interludes about the Danish, Swedish, and Geatish royal houses concerning their internal and external conflicts. In Tolkien's reconstruction, and here I'm outlining the plot in the final version from Manuscript C, Beowulf is an orphan raised by bears and adopted by a king. But initially, he's unpopular in court. He goes to rid the Golden Hole of the ogre, encounters two companions, and vanquishes both the ogre, Grinder, and its mother. He returns victorious and marries the king's daughter, becoming king eventually, and living long in the land. The Old English version is translated from the beginning of this tale up to the point at which Beowulf is about to fight the ogre Grinder. While the skeleton of the story in these two versions is the same, A few major differences can already be observed. Firstly, Tolkien's version eschews all reference to specific kings or dynastic lines. Details are added so the story coheres more tightly with the proposed folklore type, which is Panzer's Bear's Son's Tale, and the story culminates in a happy rather than a tragic ending. Critical reception of the Sellic spell largely focuses on Tolkien's engagements with fairy tale elements and on the modern English versions of the text. But I would like to focus on the Old English version, which stands testament to Tolkien's extraordinary linguistic acumen, his critical gifts, and his generative imagination. So I will first analyse how Tolkien's text can, and I would argue should, be read both as a work of art and as a piece of literary criticism. This reveals Tolkien's Beowulfian understanding of Old English poetics, which is reinforced by a comparison with Tolkien's Old English adaptation of the Old Norse poem Atlakvida. Finally, we will see an example illustrating how his creative and critical engagement with Anglo-Saxon poetics infiltrates his legendarium. Dr. Laura Varnham's talk last term stressed the importance of viewing Tolkien's critical and creative responses to Beowulf in concordance, as both index the complexity of his career-long engagement with the Old English epic. We approach his Sellic spell, then, not to assess how close he came to reconstructing a folktale source, but to witness his philological and creative impulses in action. Even the naming of characters in his Sellic spell indicates Tolkien's unique blend of scholar and sub-creator. Printed alongside the Silmarillion, Tolkien's letter to Milton Waldman reads, "Out of these languages are made nearly all the names that appear in my legends. This gives a certain character, a cohesion, a consistency of linguistic style, and an illusion of historicity to the nomenclature, or so I believe, that is markedly lacking in other comparable things." The philological ambiguity of the name Beowulf was evidently something that troubled Tolkien. He noted, with other critics, how Beowulf is one of the few characters in the Old English epic to have a name that doesn't alliterate with his father's, that is, Ecgtheow. For Tolkien, this indicated that Beowulf, the bear man, the giant killer, comes from a different world, fairy story, and so also his name does not fit within the patronymic lines of Northern history. As Paul Acker notes, in modernising the name Beowulf as Beowulf, Tolkien follows Chambers, who argues in a section called Beowulf and the Bear's Son that the name Beowulf means wolf or foe of the bee, which is to say, the bear, from its habit of raiding the hives for honey. Tolkien thus integrates his critical knowledge of Chambers' interpretation with his storytelling, producing these lines. Huni was him swideleof, and he sochte hit oft Beowudum, ofter thea revode he Beowcura huve. For them het man huna Beowulf, and he nana naman hafte, and asid an hatte he swa. Honey was greatly loved by him, and he sought it often in the woods, or more often he raided bee farmers' hives. For that men called him Beowulf, and he had no name before that, and afterwards he was thus named. The philological explanation of a curious name produces a memorable character trait and generates a narrative of its own in Tolkien's version. Beowulf himself is characterized as a social outcast who straddles the divide between the human and the non-human. When we first encounter him in the Sellic spell, he doesn't have a name, he doesn't understand human customs, and he has no command of human language. Beowulf, in the medieval world, is essentially animal in nature at the beginning of the story. Tolkien's invention of Beowulf, according to the folklore type, as raised by bears, goes to explain and complement a number of details in the original poem. One aspect of the poem that has been hotly debated is why Beowulf decides to take on Grendel without any weapons in the epic poem. So in the poem he says, "For them ich hineswerde sweban nella," which Tolkien translates as, "I will not with sword give him the sleep of death," that is, Grendel. For Tolkien, this curious detail must lie a long way back before our author, and before the attachment of folk tale to an actual character. His enumeration of Beowulf's bear-like eccentricities includes this detail, that Beowulf na nolde hina his willis wapnum wealdan, so he did not wish to wield weapons. A related detail concerns the strength of Beowulf's grip. In the poem, Beowulf describes himself as having the strength of 30 men in his hands, and Grendel, once Beowulf seizes him in combat, realizes that Nemeta mitan gerdes, erthan sheta on elran men wundgruppe maran. He had never met through Middle Earth, the corners of the world, a stronger grip amongst brave men. This is explained by Tolkien once again as a folktale element. His erma grippe werd swaswa beran klupping. The grip of his embrace was like that of a bear's. Tolkien's pronominal treatment of Beowulf is equally noteworthy. So when the king's men first come upon the orphan, the neuter pronoun is used. So nachwer bichton hier jeaxian juanon hit komme, na huelches fadra suna hit ware. None of them could ask from whence it came, nor whose father's son it was. But then the king takes Beowulf into the court, teaches him the customs of men, mana theawas laran, and from here on out, the masculine pronoun is used of Beowulf. This deliberate linguistic design foregrounds how the bear man must be progressively assimilated into human society from his outlandish roots. Many scholars, such as Geoffrey Jerome Cohen or Catherine O'Brien O'Keeffe, have noted how Beowulf, in his superhuman strength and outstanding qualities, is himself, in a way, monstrous, and fits uneasily within the strictures of the Northern Germanic whole. Tolkien's treatment of Beowulf amplifies this nuance and foregrounds the eponymous character's liminality as integral in the tale. The similarities between this version of Beowulf and the character Beorn in The Hobbit are self-evident. Both are dangerous, cantankerous, but principled men. Both are social outcasts, both are lovers of honey, and both straddle the line between bear and human being, Beorn being a shapeshifter and Beowulf in his wild upbringing. It's impossible to tell by dating alone which figure came first in Tolkien's mind. Indeed, the question is hardly helpful. But both characters demonstrate his creative adaptation of Old English and Old Norse materials. We see Tolkien continue to pick up on nuances in the poem Beowulf and dilate them in his adaptation. Beowulf, in the poem, consistently acts in ways that defy social expectations, not wielding weapons, not marrying, and Francis Lenihan has argued that the poem presents him as a threat to the dynastic social order. The Sellic spell spotlights these traits, maintaining the picture of Beowulf as a social outcast. In the poem, even before travelling to Heorot and proving his heroism, Beowulf is godmedgetum, athela und eaken, good and popular among the Geats, noble and excellent. But in the Sellic spell, his worth was not greatly counted by men, men miklas worthen eteldon. They let him sit in the low places, nor was room made for a seat for him in the Königshäle, in the king's hall. When he declares his intention to go fight the monster, both narratives describe how others fear and recognize the danger of the undertaking. He's unlikely to come back alive. Yet, in the poem, they encourage him to go, specifically despite that he him leachware, despite him being dear to them. While in the Sellic spell, Tolkien, appropriating the rhetorical effect of litotes, or understatement, that is quintessential of Anglo-Saxon poetry, states that the others let him go because he had held on that se thurs odramenia nitwerdan etan michte. They reckoned that the ogre could eat others who were more useful. In fact, scholars have analysed how Beowulf presents its hero and the most memorable monster, Grendel, as mirrors or even double selves, as Ruth Waterhouse has put it. The term aglaika, translated variously as troublemaker, hero, or monster, is used to describe the series of monsters, including Grendel, but also Beowulf, drawing these two together. In a similar way, even in the snippet of Sellic spell translated into Old English, Tolkien has carefully crafted a number of parallels that suggests he fully recognised the doubling between the monster and the hero that has been picked up on by so many critics after him. First, Beowulf and Grendel are shown to come from a common den. The same Old English word is used. So Beowulf's discovery as a child is described in this way: On tham denne fundan hier husachild. In the den they found a male child or a warrior child. Grendel, in Tolkien's version, or Grinder, takes his victims out to his den, to eat them. This is deliberate invention on Tolkien's part. In the poem, Grendel is described as dwelling in a monster mere, described variously as a Nikramere or Fenfredo, but never a den. In fact, the noun denne is not found at all in the 3,000 lines of the epic poem. Tolkien may also have hinted at how Beowulf and Grendel pose a similar threat of usurpation. Francis Lenehan's recent analysis identifies how Grendel is depicted as an anti-ruler who attempted to usurp legitimate royal authority in Heorot. This creates a parallel with Beowulf's threat to the Order of Heorot, when he's adopted by the king Hrothgar and threatens succession by Hrothgar's sons, something that Hrothgar's wife is quick to notice and remedy in the original epic. I might be as bold to suggest that Tolkien could have picked up on Beowulf's threat to the dynastic order. Notably, he describes first how Eile nicht ríksede se Eoten on thera guldenen hele thas Königes. All night the giant ruled in the golden hall as a king. And when Beowulf barges into the hall, Tolkien carefully places him all the way in front of the Kunesetle, so he goes in boldly until he fore them Kunesetle gestod, echoing how, in the poem, Grendel approaches the Yifstol in Heorot. For readers familiar with the epic poem, this hat tip is difficult to ignore, signalling yet another subtle parallel of monster and hero. The figure of Helm Hammerhand, who is recorded in the appendices to The Lord of the Rings, represents a darker reincarnation of this murky ruler figure within Tolkien's Middle-earth. His failed dynastic line, the tragic end to his reign, and his superhuman strength distinctly echo Beowulf. And in this quotation, we see that he is likened to a snow troll. Helm Hammerhand becomes the Aglaika par excellence, a complete unity of monster and man. Another character that demonstrates Tolkien's critical creativity in the Sellic spell is Unferth or Unfrith or Unfriend. Unferth is the name of this character in the original poem, whereas Unfrith is what Tolkien gives to this character. Tolkien ascribes the origin of Unferth to historical legend and posits that he is a well-known character associated with Heorot. Unferth, son of Ecglaf, he writes, was already a well-known figure in the court of Heorot before ever our author wrote his Beowulf. No visit to Heorot would be complete without a glimpse of him. It would be like going to Camelot and never hearing of Sir Kay. He writes of Unferth's name, his name is significant because it is significant. That is, it has a name suitable to his function. Unferth means unpeace, quarrel. Tolkien's renaming of Unferth to Unfrith demonstrates his philological precision in action. So Ferth in Old English could mean bravery or courage, or also the mind, the soul, or the spirit, but he clearly takes the meaning of the compound to mean unpeace. And so, this is literally what he produces with the new name, Unfrith, which is derived from the Old Norse cognate Ofrith, and is attested in Old English prose only in the speech of a character who is specifically described as a Scandinavian. So one can imagine the philological satisfaction Tolkien derived of innovating this form for the name of a distinctly northern character. To the figure of Unferth and Unfrith, whatever you decide to call him, Tolkien adds yet another layer of flourish. The character is, in Tolkien's estimation, a literary relative of those wicked counsellors that have the ear of aged kings. In the poem, Unferth is cast merely as an untrustworthy and unlikable figure, and there is little suggestion that he's a sorcerer of any kind, except for the single phrase that he onband beadurune. The word rune is, in Old English, associated with magic, but it is possible to interpret the compound as Folk does, as simply indicating Unferth unbound concealed his hostility. Tolkien, however, reads this as unloosing a spell for the creating of strife in his translation. In the Sellic spell, he heightens this characteristic by stating explicitly, Odra suma quad on thea that he drew crafty wara and galdor kutha. Some others said, though, that he was a sorcerer and knew incantations, and that his counsel more often caused discord than they settled peace. The amplification of Unfrith's association with dark magic serves to give the reconstructed folktale a greater sense of, as Tolkien would say, the fairy. The figure of a sorcerer corrupting an aged king was clearly one that captivated Tolkien, and one only has to look at the figure of Grima Wormtongue in Theoden's court to see the trope's incarnation in Middle-earth. Another invention on Tolkien's part concerns the motivations for Unferth's hostility towards Beowulf. Many scholars find the explanation in the original epic unsatisfactory. We are told that Beowulf's mission is, quote, a mikil athunka, a severe irritation to Unferth, because he cannot abide anyone else achieving more glory than he himself has. Tolkien apparently also found the reasons for Unferth's hostility lacking, and he adds an important detail in the Sellic spell. In the original epic, the queen plays no part in the story before Unferth challenges Beowulf, and she says nothing until after Beowulf has killed Grendel. In the Sellic spell, however, she greets Beowulf with the rather provocative statement, Swithe gladu eomitron moda, the ich eft to saw the man on this a hele yaseo. I am very glad in my heart that I see once again a true man in this hall. This comment apparently emasculates all the men under the king, if not the king himself, and the ensuing description that thasward evil elikadon them hiridmanum, the men of the household did not like this statement at all, confirms that the queen's speech is to be taken as a challenge to their masculinity. This provides a more compelling reason for Unfrith's hostility, especially when one considers Old Norse laws regarding need, so any insult to a man's masculinity was, in the saga world, often a trigger for violent acts, and was also punishable by law. This is strengthened by the fact that the practice of sorcery in Old Icelandic law codes was taken as an indication of sexual deviancy. Viewed in this context, Unfrith's challenge to Beowulf doesn't only make perfect sense, but also highlights how Unfrith is clearly insulted, but not brave enough, as one might expect of a saga character, to take on Beowulf in physical combat. The portrayal of Unfrith is a marvelous example of how Tolkien infuses his scholarship on Beowulf with his creativity, and how this engagement with the character trickles into The Lord of the Rings, which he worked on roughly simultaneously. While Tolkien's Sellic spell demonstrates a transformation out of Old English poetry, his Atlakvida showcases an effort to recast Norse material into an Anglo-Saxon poetic idiom. Such analysis necessitates a bit of background on the Norse Poetic Edda and on Tolkien's engagement therewith. So the Poetic Edda is the name generally given to a series of Old Norse poems collected in the late 13th century manuscript called the Codex Regius, originating from Iceland. And it's generally divided into two sections. So the first section are mythological poems focusing on the Old Norse pantheon, and the second section are heroic poems, which center around the hero Sigurdur's exploits, death, and the aftermath thereof. Tolkien composed two modern English retellings of the Edda, the first Volsungakvida and Nuya, focusing on the life of Sigurdur, and Gudrunarkvida and Nuya, centering on Gudrun and the aftermath of Sigurdur's death. It is written entirely in strophic or stanzaic form, in the Icelandic alliterative meter of Fornúðarslag, and broadly following the narrative structure of the Poetic Edda. The fragments of Atlakvida, which Tolkien translated into Old English poetry, are situated after the hero Sigurdur's death, and after his lover, Brynhildur's suicide. Gudrun, his widow, has since married Atli, identified with Attila the Hun. In the poem, Atli invites Gudrun's brothers, Gunnar and Hogni, under the pretenses of a celebration, but this is in fact a trap to kill them and capture the Rhinegold, which he thinks they know where it is. Gudrun sends a ring to her brothers with a wolf's hair to warn them of the peril, but against the advice of their sister, they come anyways. The sections which Tolkien translated pertain firstly to Gunnar and Hogni's reaction to Atli's invitation and Gudrun's warning, and later the scene surrounding Gunnar's death, by being thrown into a pit of serpents. Cheerful stuff. One remarkable feature of these fragments is Tolkien's flair with the Old English poetic idiom. There are various instances in his Atlac in which Tolkien introduces wordplay where there is no corresponding technique in the source material. So, for example, this first example, we see Wer glocum wand, wer nunga yatea. There's a pun on the element where. So this line translates to, wound with a wolf's hair, she offered us warning. Wer glucum, wolf's hair, is an invented word and is transposed to a pun on warning, wernunga. The second example, Hringboga snikon, wermas yaridene wagum on inan, which translates to something along the lines of the snake's rove on the inside. Hringboga is a kenning for serpent, literally meaning ring arch. So this pun on hring is especially potent given the warning ring that is sent by Gudrun. The gruesome demise by snakes is linked to the fateful rings of the narrative. Tolkien also uses extensive variation, which is a typical feature of Old English poetry. So in the Old English translation here, we have drukon drichtguman on dreorselle, mod mythenden meldan saton, huna hetethank halathon dreordon. Notice that each of these lines has double alliteration. So there are 3 alliterating elements rather than the only necessary 2. And firstly, he adds the idea of dreorselle to translate the Old Norse word volholu. So the image is transposed from a war hall to an exilic motif, a dreary hole. Dreorselle also has oral echoes with on dreordon in the final line of this excerpt. There's also extensive variation. So we have Dritguman, Meldan, and Haleth, 3 separate words to describe the warriors. Whereas in the Old Norse, we only have Drottmegir and then the third person pronoun Ther. These additions could just be metrical, but in any case, it sees Tolkien working really well and impressively in the Old English poetic idiom. In his Atlac he also includes a near-direct quotation from Beowulf, illustrating how much the epic poem influenced his idea of Old English poetic style. So this line, which originally described Beowulf's dragon fight, is now used to describe Gunnar's death by being eaten alive by serpents. So the Stefan, the voice that came out from the Harnestan, the hard stone, goes from battling warriors by the dragon mound to the anguished cries of a hero as he is eaten alive. In another instance, Tolkien supplies the line Leotalif beloran werdan, Leotalif samod beloran werdan, for a section corrupted in the Old Norse. The collocation of Leotalif samod is natural too, but not extant in the entire corpus of Old English poetry. However, in Tolkien's 1940 preface to Wren's revision of the Clark Hall translation of Beowulf, he employs the same phrase, Leote und Leif Samod, to describe the hour of death when all things will perish. All of these examples highlight the influence that Beowulf had on Tolkien's Old English poetic imagination. This is further borne out by the fact that, compared to the Norse original, Tolkien's adaptation apparently introduces a focus on the dynastic elements and an emphasis on ideas of kingship. This could suggest he modelled his Old English narration of heroic stories on the style of Beowulf's historic digressions and picked up on the dynastic elements therein that Francis Lenehan has recently argued is central to the poem's construction. So, in these examples, in the first one, where the Old Norse just has Gunnar turned his head, we have Helmburgende, the Lord of the Burgundians, or literally the helmet of the Burgundians. Think Helm Hammerhand. And in the second example, where we have Liefendegram, the living hero, we have, in the Old English, Leod Liefjende, the living king. In the third example, rather than a hero who needs to guard gold from his enemies, we have a Folkkuning, a Guthfreya, a king of the people, a warlike lord who should guard his gold against foes. That Tolkien associates the Old English poetic mediums with these elements of kingship and dynasticism is confirmed by the fact that these elements are stripped back from the Sellic spell. Tolkien's idea of the Old English poetic world, then, is one that is mapped according to the contours of Beowulf, the archetype of vernacular composition on heroic themes. Far from focusing only on the monsters of Beowulf at the expense of its dynastic digressions, as some have criticised, Tolkien recognised both as integral to the Old English poet's art. In his essay on the tradition of versification on Old English, Tolkien makes the comment that Beowulf is a scholarly and consciously artistic product of the union of minstrelsy and letters and antiquarian lore, of the harp and the pen. The same comment could easily describe Tolkien's subcreation of Middle-earth, a creative project born out of philological inquiry. Tolkien's distinctly Beowulfian Poetics is undoubtedly an important backdrop to his legendarium, and the remainder of my talk will trace one example of a concept from Beowulf that is explored in the Sellic spell and subsequently reincarnated in Middle-earth. So, as a scholar, Tolkien highlighted how the Hall of Heorot had a religious significance, being associated with the pagan gods Njordr and Freyr, Froda and Ingeld in the poem. But Heorot is also associated with Christian creation. The poem presents parallel narratives of constructing the whole and then a Cadmonian court poet singing of creation, almost like a consecration of the whole. Yet Grendel is already lurking as they sing. He is introduced immediately after the creation narrative, described as Cain's kinne, the kin of Cain. He becomes a literalization of the evil that corrupts and overshadows creation. The idea is poetically reiterated in the Sellic spell. Tolkien describes how Grindr literally nachtwilch seamode on thara hale. He literally hung over the whole like a shadow every night. There's a similar construction of events in the account of Arda's creation and fall in the Silmarillion. So, in this quotation, we witness the same oblivion to approaching darkness. They did not perceive the shadow in the north that was cast from afar by Melkor. The same corruption of creation during festal activity. So we have Nessa dancing before the Valar, and Melkor growing dark even as this happens. And the similar image of the Night of the Void, transposed from the poetic sources into a cosmic drama. In the Old English poem, the threefold repetition of com as Grendel approaches Heorot has been described as cinematic in execution, creating a foreboding sense of the inevitable approach of darkness, shadow, and cloud. So first we have com on Wanranit on dark night, and then under Mistkleadum, misty, the cover of mist, and then finally Grendel bursts into the hole. This is echoed by the image of shadows at the end of the Old English portion of the Sellic spell, directly before Grinder's approach. So, word on Shead Walange over Eartham. So the shadows became long over the earth. There's something very Middle-earthian about that sentence. The image evoked is of cosmic significance for Tolkien. Grendel, he writes, is an enemy who has attacked the centre of the realm and brought into the royal hall the outer darkness. That same motif of darkness dawning unawares during festivities, bringing outer darkness of evil, is echoed in the Silmarillion. Even as the Valar are feasting, in that very hour Melkor and Ungoliant came hastening over the fields of Valinor, as the shadow of a black cloud upon the wind fleets over the sunlit earth. There are clear echoes of the imagery in Beowulf and in the Sellic spell here, an affinity that is confirmed when we look at the Old English chronicles of the event, which are recorded in the history of Middle-earth, where Melkor and Ungoliant at Burston under Weaxandum Sheadum. So they burst into Valinor under the growing shadows. Another instantiation of this motif occurs in The Return of the King. Grond, the wolf's head, which is inspired by the hammer of the underworld within Middle-earth, breaks into Minas Tirith in a way that is apparently patterned after Grendel's approach to Heorot. So the quotations I've extracted are the opening sentences of a series of paragraphs in the sequence, structuring this episode anaphorically. So we have the threefold repetition of the drums rolled louder, the drums rolled and rattled. We have the similar crescendo of Grond crawled on, Grond was hurled forward. And at the moment that he bursts through the gate, we have the emphasis again on threefold repetition of thrice he cried, thrice the great ram boomed. The consonants of Grond and Grendel, the interweaving of threefold repetitions, the similar intimation of the forces of evil penetrating and invading the civilized world. The scene surely records one more, among many, of Tolkien's sensitive responses to the art of the Beowulf poet, reworked with a characteristically individual vision. The monster here is not an ogre of the primeval world, as in Beowulf, but specifically one associated with engines and rams, a distorted, diabolical picture of the horrors of mechanized warfare. What this brief example demonstrates is by no means exhaustive, but it does highlight how considering the concomitants of Tolkien's critical and creative activity provides a nuanced perspective on his subcreation of Middle-earth. His creative adaptations of literary works are an important resource for such research. They show these twin impulses in fusion, giving us a glimpse into how the Tolkienian imagination comprehends medieval sources, in both this modern sense of comprehend as understanding and in its more archaic sense of including. So, a quick recapitulation. Examining the Old English version of the Sellic spell highlights Tolkien's developing critical opinions on the work of Beowulf, as well as his views on its original folktale source. While he strips the story back, removing the historical elements which he argued in 1936 were so overemphasized, his treatment of characters in particular proves illuminating and demonstrates affinities with analyses of current scholarship. What also emerges is that the alliterative poetic style, which first captivated him as a schoolboy, continues to resonate in his poetry, as is evident in the Atlachvíða. Contrasting Sellic's spell with Atlachvíða demonstrates that while he campaigned for Beowulf's merit as fiction, he was sensitive to its nuanced treatment of dynastic history. His Old English extracts suggest his view that Anglo-Saxon poetry is shadowed by dynastic concerns, not least evident in the clear influence of Beowulf on these adaptations. They also demonstrate his creativity in adopting poetic formula and techniques. We have also seen one brief example of Tolkien's creative and critical engagement with the text of Beowulf influencing his world building, revealing how his appropriation of sources is not a direct translation of elements from native tradition into mythical world, but involves a nuanced and thoughtful negotiation of the evocative and symbolic potentials of source material. Despite his incisive analysis in The Monsters and the Critics of Beowulf as a great temporal tragedy composed in a heroic elegiac style, his Sellic spell suggests a rebellion against the tragic ending. He is devoted to writing into existence the asterisk reality of a Beowulf tale that resolves in a happy ending. In his Sellic spell, the disturbing implications of Beowulf's failure to marry and his tragic death for his kingdom are reconciled by the fairy tale ending of his marriage and his long life. A great lord he became, with broad lands and many rings, and he wedded the king's only daughter. And after the king's day was done, Beowulf became king in his stead, and lived long in glory. As long as he loved honey dearly, and the mead in his hall was ever of the best. Tolkien takes from the original epic poem the idea of ending on a superlative adjective. But rather than the ambiguous assessment of Beowulf as lofgjernost, most eager for glory in the original poem, we have the endearing detail that his mead was the best, a decidedly celebratory note on which to end. Jane Beale has pointed out that this treatment is yet another example of Tolkien's eucatastrophe, which he poignantly espouses in his 1939 lecture on fairy stories. In this essay, he writes, "But in God's kingdom, the presence of the greatest does not depress the small. Redeemed man is still man. Story, fantasy still go on and should go on. The Evangelium has not abrogated legends. It has hallowed them, especially the happy ending." It is a necessary reminder that while Tolkien approached his Old English works with the rigorous analytical mind of the scholar, he also infused it with the values and worldview of the devout Christian. The eucatastrophic ending of his Sellic spell, then, shouldn't surprise us. It is an expression of his fundamental views on the role of stories and of legend. To return to the lines in Beowulf from which Tolkien took the title Sellic spell, the original poem has Sellic spell alliterate with sodd und sarlich, true and grievous. This is an appropriate epithet for Beowulf, the epic poem, in which the poet artistically reconstructs a lost time of Germanic heroism, subcreating a secondary world in which the complicated politics and tragic endings are, in the Tolkienian sense, true. What Tolkien does in his Sellic spell, however, is redeem Beowulf from its sarlich ending and provide his own yselig, or happy, ending as a palimpsest, thereby conferring an additional layer of truth or soth. And this modification of the lines from Beowulf is a palimpsest of my own. His Sellic spell purports to represent a story, not the story of Beowulf. Thus, Tolkien's adaptations provide us with a story of the Germanic world that ultimately, as Tolkien believed, is shaped by and reflects a glimpse of the story, that of the Evangelion. The happy resolutions point to the ultimate happy ending towards which all of fiction, history, and truth strive. But exploring the dynamics of his creativity and his faith lies beyond my scope and merits a whole nother talk. Thank you.